Here we go.
Yep. Welcome, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the performance. It's a pleasure to be back. My name is Andy Bryant. I'm the Executive Director of Siegel Family Foundation. For the thousands of you who are watching live, and surely the millions of you who will eventually watch this recording, and most importantly, my partner in crime, Mr. Kofi Oppentang, welcome. This is the session, The Future of Western Philanthropy. A little bit of background on why we put this on. 2020 has ushered in quite a lot of critique of philanthropy. I think a lot of folks are rightfully questioning the lack of diversity of its decision makers. To be very candid, our wonderful conference sponsors, our own Siegel Family Foundation and the Robert Bosch Stiftung, are emblematic of Western philanthropists, founded by wealthy white men and led by charming and charismatic white men as well. We hold immense power. That's surely true. What's relevant to this conversation is how that power is yielded. Another question we hear is not only who makes the decisions, but also who receives the benefit of that philanthropy. We hear from Western philanthropists quite often a lot of rhetoric, some might call it hot air, about funding locally, funding proximately, funding closer to communities we seek to serve and support. During crises like COVID-19, the latest natural disaster, Ebola, post-election violence, all of these crises always spur international funders to seek out local organizations who are rooted in the communities they serve. But once the crisis subsides, these same funders often revert back to old practices of supporting expat-led efforts to develop Africa and elsewhere in the global south. Finally, many question why philanthropy exists in the first place. But let's accept for the purpose of this session that there's a meaningful role that private wealth can play in improving lives across the continent and elsewhere. So what's that role, you might ask? Well, that's what we're here to discuss today. You also might be asking why I have this enormous key hanging from my neck. The reason is my 5-year-old Evie knew I was nervous as I left the house early this morning. She got up with the roosters like I did, and she gave me this key as a good luck charm. She wears it often to kindergarten, and so I wear it here. I decided to turn it into a metaphor for the role of Western philanthropists, or at least the role of Siegel Family Foundation. This key represents my role as a glorified doorman. My role is to unlock doors and usher through as many African visionaries, as many local rock stars, as we call them, as many vibrant local ideas and idealists as possible, and give them a stage and a platform like this one to confront, to interrogate, to promote their work, to engage Western philanthropists on an equal footing. Several years ago here at Siegel Family, we began to realize the abysmal record of Western philanthropy in their support for African development. We all know some of the same stats. You can count on one hand the percentage of at least US international giving that goes to Africa, that goes to local African-led organizations. Some studies cited as 2% of giving from the US to Africa. The generous one cited as perhaps 4%. Either way, it's abysmal. This led us, this recognition, led Siegel Family Foundation to drastically shift our funding practices towards funding more locally led orgs and to advocate other funders to do the same. It's based on a simple premise, right? More often than not, we believe supporting local solutions leads to more impactful, more just, and more sustainable solutions. Simple as that. Before we move on, I want to give a big shout out to our SFF team. I have the lofty title of executive director, but in fact, I do stand on the shoulders of giants. Thanks to our team for the support you provide. Finally, I want to give a warm welcome and gratitude to our founder, Barry Siegel, who you heard from earlier in the day. He is a troublemaker of the best kind, and so many of us here stir things up because of his inspiration. Now on to our main event. I want to introduce Mr. Oppentang. Among his many accolades that I've been reviewing the last few days with wide eyes, I didn't see an honorary degree in engineering amongst Kofi. You might correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe you are the ultimate bridge builder. In your role as the president of African American Institute, you do exactly that. AAI was founded in 1953. Its mission is to promote enlightened engagement between Africa and America through education, training, and dialogue. The key word here is enlightened, right? He also has done board service with the Conrad Hilton Foundation and the International Center for Transitional Justice, or currently serves on those boards. Right? He formerly served as Ford Foundation's chairperson. So he brings a wealth of experience and certainly a wealth of bridge building to this conversation. Before we get started, I want to give Kofi an opportunity to tell us what's going on at AAI 2020. How are you handling this tumultuous year?
Well, good morning, Andy. So it's great to be here with you and your many listeners all over the world. I think at AAI, just like most organizations, we really had to do some recalibration and some rethinking. And what we started about 15 months ago to really look back at some of the ideas in the early years of our founding, what was the inspiration of our founders. And a couple of them, a couple of the co-founders, William Leo Hansberry and Horace Mann Bond, had some ideas that there really needed to be a lot of work to help support Africans who were newly arriving at American universities. But when we go back and we look at what their beliefs were, it was clear that they had a much bigger experiment underway. They understood that that Afro-descendants in the U.S. Were assumed to be inferior. And they thought that part of the solution of changing that perception among everyone, including among Afro-descendants, was to really see African countries and Africans become successful. We know that many great stories of African Americans who have done amazing work, but often overlooked is the work that African Americans have done that have really inspired and nurtured a lot of Africans. And so AAI was really founded with that in mind, in the hopes of kind of changing this whole narrative about what an Afro-descendant is, what an African is, and what Africa's role in the world has been.
Very good, thank you. Before we get started on the discussion, I want to ask anyone with questions for Kofi, please type them into the chat bar, and they'll get forwarded along to us. Also, tell us what the future of philanthropy means to you. What's your ideal case? I think most of the folks listening in today are probably practitioners, although we have a fair amount of who would categorize themselves as funders as well. But what does the future of Western philanthropy look like for you? Okay, Kofi, without further ado, let's get started. Yeah, as mentioned, you sat on the boards of both the Ford Foundation and Conrad Hilton Foundation. From my perspective, these are two fairly progressive funders, but in very different ways. Ford, on the one hand, has become a bit of an exemplar for investing in new ideas, new leaders, institution building. And one of the things that stood out for us most recently was supporting the resilience and excellence of your grantees through its BUILD program, right? What I would term as a supercharged capacity program, not for project-based stuff, rather the true organizational capacity, endurance of excellent works on the continent. Hilton, on the other hand, has a long-term commitment to humanitarian support through support of Catholic Sisters, safe water, homelessness, fostering youth initiatives, but it does so in a really data-driven, quantitative manner. Each takes its work really seriously, and they seem to hold themselves to a degree of accountability that I frankly think is too rare in the sector. So I'd like to delve into your experiences with both Ford and Hilton as they've navigated these tumultuous past few years and maybe past few months. When you reflect on your time with each, where do you see opportunities for Western philanthropy to put resources into the global south, but doing responsibly, respectfully, and justly?
Mm-hmm. All right. So first, I want to just acknowledge that I actually don't know anybody who really has a great handle on the answer to that question. But I think it's a useful question for us to kind of interrogate. But but I want to kind of put my cards on the table in terms of my biases. So um, having served for 12 years on a board, a philanthropic grant making board, and now I'm in my second year with the Conrad Hilton Foundation, I'm very much an insider and looking for ways to help organizations that I think are genuinely interested in making a positive difference. But I also recognize that it's really hard to do philanthropy well, really, really hard. And it takes a lot of experimentation. And if you're not willing to take chances and make mistakes for which you may well be criticized for, right, then I think it's going to be very hard for you to find your way. So I think that both organizations are great places because there's a genuine commitment from top to bottom to really take it very seriously and try to really think about how to make the most difference. Because of the different things they work on, understanding what success looks like for their grant making and their partnerships is different. So if you're doing safe water, foster youth, Catholic Sisters, etc., there are some quantitative measures that are helpful. How many people are experiencing homelessness each year? How long are they in the system? Do they come back after they've exited that experience? All those kinds of things are helpful. They don't tell the full picture, but they're very, very helpful in understanding whether or not there's progress been made. And I think that's why the monitoring, evaluation, and learning work at Hilton does take cognizance of a lot of these quantitative measures. At Ford, on the other hand, they spent decades supporting leaders, supporting new institutions and new ideas. And there were many years when things went the opposite way than they were hoping. And then there's progress, right? So what success looks like for much of Ford's work is a much more challenging thing to assess, right? And when I was there, my own personal view was that you really needed to look at how the ideas that had been nurtured, how many of them had really become mainstream and had become important ideas, how many of the institutions that were supported had endured and it's really become substantial actors in the ecosystem that you need when you're working on things like rights. And so those stories became for me the way that I best understood how effective the grant making was going to be. The other thing I would say is that there's huge diversity, right? Like in philanthropy, just like there are, amongst individuals, right? It's how you go about it, what you focus on. Everybody's got a different thing, and I think that diversity overall is a strength, but there's probably more work that needs to be done on collaboration, because that diversity is great because we actually don't know what works. And often it takes a long time to figure out what's happening, and the world keeps changing and evolving, and problems sometimes they metastasize, sometimes they become less urgent. But I think it's generally true to say that there hasn't been enough collaboration, and that collaboration opportunities for collaboration will greatly increase both the trust people have in philanthropy and the overall effectiveness of it.
Two things stood out that I want to highlight, and I also see reiterated in the comments. One was around funders of all shapes and sizes better embracing risk, right? We're in a sector where if your name isn't Gates or USAID, if you're not representing perhaps public capital, you're just simply not big enough if you want to meet the ambition you have as a funder to not take some calculated risk. And unfortunately, I think that risk aversion is omnipresent in philanthropy. So it's great to hear, and I think the comments echo this. You hear about sort of folks we term on the larger end, mega funders, having a risk appetite like Ford. The other is around collaboration. We're going to follow up this summit with an 8-day conference on funders playing nice someday, where we all just sit around and provide examples when we've not been able to collaborate well. Joking, of course, but yeah, it's stymied us at Siegel Family how challenging it is to get folks that agree in principle on something, let alone sign on the bottom line and truly have a tangible example of collaboration, juxtaposed with the intense pressure we put on our NGO partners to do the same, right? The ultimate example of sort of do as I say, not as I do. Okay, which maybe is a good segue to this next question. You know, where do you find Western funders getting it wrong still in their efforts to pour resources responsibly and justly into places in the global South?
Okay, so I think that the kind of segregating capital into kind of a Western funder framework, right? It's kind of a useful thing to do to help one understand, right, the world sometimes, but it's not sufficient. And it, I think, has the danger of making people afraid to take risk, right? And to be more transparent, right? If there's almost an oppositional framing, right? So there are funders that are, people of color who are equally capable of making the same mistakes. I think that, so anyway, I'm just, if you're trying to change something, I think the framing is really important. And so for me, there's wealth, right, which we know is disproportionately, right, in places like the US and in Europe, but not exclusively there. And there are challenges people are trying to address in other parts of the world that have in many ways been kind of, quote, left behind, right? And I think one of the common things that I think people get wrong is, first of all, just what philanthropy can do. One has to be realistic about it, and what one can do with the area one's chosen to focus on. And if you aren't clear-eyed about that, I think you end up adopting strategies and approaches that end up possibly being very counterproductive. So scaling what you're doing to what the real opportunities are and being clear about how one can make a difference, I think are really critical things. There's been a lot of discussion, and I think it's right, that there is this kind of top-down approach, which, again, I think stems more from, if you're wealthy, you're powerful, maybe you run a big business, maybe you've been successful, people all around you kind of reinforce that that your ideas are the best ideas. People don't really tell the truth, right, to a lot of funders. Some of the biggest laughs that you see are when very powerful people tell a bad joke, and everybody breaks up, in the room and kind of acts like it's like the funniest thing they've ever heard. So I think we're all kind of, many of us have kind of enabled, right, a lot of this, what we now look back on as kind of, bad behavior. And so I think it's important that we kind of fess up to that. But I think the two main issues, I think, for me is being clear-eyed about what's possible, mm-hmm. and not listening enough to people who you really need their engagement in order for you to have success. And one of the things, it's almost like an unconscious bias thing, right? In other fields, when unless you've been somebody who's had to raise money, right, and try to get into a door, one often doesn't really understand that power dynamic. And you think you're expecting someone can open up and tell you things. But unless you've sat on both sides, and one of the things I think big philanthropies have learned from and are trying to do a better job of is kind of hiring the right type of people, the kind of people who have great listening skills, who are cross-culturally competent, who are able to really put people at ease. And you mentioned this Build program at Ford. One of the things that did was allow for greater honest conversation, because if someone knows that they already have the flexible money, they can talk about what to do with the organization with a supporter that they know is committed to be them for a number of years, with them for a number of years. So I think this whole power dynamic, this sense of what the role is and what's really possible, being clear about those things, those are the things I would think that are most important to get right.
So be clear-eyed about what's possible, and more importantly, what's not possible. Be really, really realistic about expecting an honest to goodness relationship to be built with your partners. If I listened well, I heard a third, which is I'm probably not as funny as I think I am, right? No, to that second point around expecting honesty.
You're not as tall, you're not as handsome. No. All right.
Well, been exposed in live. We should have done this pre-recorded so we could edit that. Yeah, to that second point around expecting honesty, we gratefully support a podcast called What Donors Want, and they interview all sorts of funder luminaries. And invariably, the quotes that get cycled through social media are about, we want to develop this honest, equitable relationship with our partners. And it's just said with slight derivations, slightly different wording. And it always feels like if this is, and these are the smartest, best placed funders, the most realistic, experienced folks, and they still strive for that. It's a bit of a perhaps unrealistic expectation. But I loved your point around the composition of the team really matters, right? I alluded to our shift in our grant making portfolio from largely expat-led to largely locally led over the past few years. The eureka moment that preceded that for us was, in hindsight, common sense, which was hiring local, right? A shift in our team's complexion and composition. And I'm really, frankly, proud to say we are now, the vast majority of our team, over 2/3, live in, reside in, were educated in, went to clinics in East Africa. And I think that makes a difference for us, certainly. Mm-hmm. In the level of rigor and landscape understanding we can bring to diligence, and more importantly to the support perhaps we can provide to partners, and the connections we can make. Okay, cool. In my intro, I talked about this sort of rhetoric piece. Funders generally agreeing that ideally more resources need to flow directly and seamlessly to locally led orgs across sub-Saharan Africa. But all of us struggle to shift our systems and our dollars towards that lofty goal. And this is where we get into the yeah buts. I want to move money to local organizations, but we only fund 501c3 designated orgs. We aren't able to conduct site visits, therefore our interaction, which needs to be in person, has to happen in New York. So, ... All sorts of logistical or philosophical barriers to that money moving to match that rhetoric. How do we move beyond the yeah buts to real change? Funders able to logistically meet that rhetoric and move resources directly into the hands of local orgs. Where does that ignition come from?
So I think with the places that I've been involved with, this really starts with a conversation between the board and the leadership team, principally the CEO. And boards have to make clear that these are the problems they want addressed and that they want reporting on it, right? These are things that one can measure, right? And if a team understands that they're hired that way, when the most important hire a board makes, obviously, is the CEO. And you've got to be real clear about what that partnership looks like. What is the job? What does success look like? If you're not clear about that, then sometimes the reason you get the yeah buts is the leadership team isn't being measured by this. They can't afford to spend all their time trying to solve a problem that's maybe not that important to their board. But if it is important to their board, all the examples you gave, we know there are lots of ways to solve those, right? You roll up your sleeves, you focus, you can solve these things. These are not the biggest challenges in the world. So I think that will, if there was one thing that would change, vastly reduce a lot of those situations, it's that the commitment from the board and that clear understanding with the leadership team. This is a priority, and you do that through the agendas you set for your meetings and the information that you ask for to be reported over time.
Very, very good. Yeah, I'm glad you alluded to board commitment. Okay. COVID-19. I don't know how heavy it is, but the elephant in the room. It's exposed a lot of. I think it's exposed a lot of challenges for Western philanthropy vis-a-vis investment in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm wondering, in your experience, both with Hilton and folks you've observed more remotely, like, how has Western philanthropy responded to COVID-19 this year?
I think that what you call the mega funders, I think have done overall a terrific job, right? They, so many of them didn't just make announcements about putting more money to work. They also streamlined processes for grants. They changed budgets. They went to their grantees, and said, that restricted money that I gave you, we're open to you coming back to us with a much more flexible approach, because a lot of the assumptions upon which we did the grant making, right, have changed. And this is the way we want to support you. So I know of lots of situations like that. At Conrad Hilton, they had some unallocated money that they were in conversations with. They went and had great conversations with people and said, look, we're not backing away from funding you, but we think that it's urgent. And then the next 30 days or 45 days, we put a pause and really focus on our COVID-19 response, because people are actually, if we move now, we can save a lot of lives. And so I would say that the response was, all the ones that I've seen have been terrific. The disappointing part is that the systems were just so weak in the first place, right? It's one of those things where there had not been long-term investment in public health in many, many parts of the world. And that's something that we need to address, not wait for the next pandemic, but start investing in that now.
Very good. I'll hold our last question till the end. I wanted to shift to some of the audience questions. There's some really rich ones. I'll give you a buffet of a cup, 3, and then you can select your favorite or most answerable from among them. Apologies if I'm not citing where the question came from, and apologies too if my video is gone. Someone smarter than me is going to have to fix that. One of the audience members asked about funding policy research, whether or not this might be a way for funders to be truly catalytic, kind of shifting, investing in policy research and the evidence base so that you can see dramatic changes in how governments are building systems to respond to various development issues. Second question, I think, is a really rich one and asked by several people, was around how global philanthropy has been influenced, impacted, affected by Black Lives Matter here in the US. Whether or not that's BLM and the movement, the discussions here have enabled some sort of rethink, re-examination of how global philanthropy is done. Last question I wanted to put in this bundle from my good friend Jacques at Amani Global Works in DRC. Our funders, he said, funders talk about having this honest, equitable relationship of transparency. Are funders ready to embrace the truth? Dun, dun, dun. I think that's a great question. How can we brace ourselves for the critical or constructive feedback we might get if there really was an open dialogue? So you got policy research, BLM impact, and funders ready to embrace the truth about how they look.
I'm going to try to take a stab at all 3. So, policy research. So, I think that there is always opportunity to continue policy research and to update it and rethink it. But my sense is that there has been tons of investment in policy research. The real challenge is translating that into actual public policy actions, right? Implementing things that have become very, very clear from the research. If there's the low-hanging fruit, I think, are the things we already know, that if we had the political will to do them, all the research supports that you could really have transformative impact in many, many areas. But I do think it's important that policy research kind of have stable support, because we learn new things, new challenges, new opportunities all the time, and we can't afford to turn off that tap and just focus on implementing what we know. You have to have some balance, and that diversity that you have in philanthropy, I think, assures that there will be some balance, because there are some people, there's some organizations that's their focus, funding policy, and there are others where their focus is much more on implementation, getting action on things, and that to me is kind of where the effort needs to be. I think the Black Lives Matter movement has had an enormous impact on the conversations that are happening amongst funders, including in boardrooms. It's still too early to know whether it's going to translate into real concrete actions and positive change. But there's reason to be hopeful. I tend to be more of an optimist and think that that's kind of the approach one has to bring, because that means you don't give up, right? When you have hope, you can keep striving for things. When you think things are hopeless, it's the options become pretty dark. I think that this issue of are funders ready? What's the line from the movie? Can you handle the truth? I think is the suggestion here, and I think that funders are more ready than they used to be. But again, I think this is something that boards really need to focus on. You've got to really make sure that you have evidence that you have people, your grant makers, are the right types of people who are who find that honesty to be really helpful. And I think that there are much more honest conversations going on because of things like increasing use of general support has leveled the playing field somewhat. And boards have said they want this to happen, and I'm seeing it happen more. So not all funders are ready for the truth, but many are. And I don't think it's hard to figure out who they are.
I promise I'm nodding my head vigorously, even if my video is not working. Mm-hmm. Couple other big thorny questions I wanted to pose from the audience. Again, with repeated asks for this. What's the responsibility of funders to be accountable directly to end users, right? So, you know, the simplest path is what is the direct relationship? What is the funder's accountability to the entities it supports, the NGOs, the social enterprises, what have you? But what about the link between funders directly to beneficiaries is a bad word, but you know, end users, the communities they seek to serve, right? The second is around lived experience, right? So this notion that how do we have lived experience, you know, become part of the equation. When a funder is calculating who to fund, how to fund, where to fund, how do we build that into our diligence process and make that, I hope, represent the value I think it holds in terms of local expertise, localized knowledge, lived experience.
Okay. All right. So accountability. So I think that there is a responsibility that funders kind of collectively have to have kind of a healthy ecosystem of grantees, because without that, you're going to not have the ability of those organizations to do what you hope they can do. If you just fund them to do very, very specific things for you, then you're really the one that's responsible for the results, right? You're driving everything. But in terms of the populations that those grantees are trying to serve, I think that funders need to, in their kind of monitoring and evaluation and learning work, they need to have ways to get that information. Usually they can do that by working collaboratively with their grantees, because if you really want to have impact, then who are the people who are going to tell you if things are improving? It's the people whose experience you're trying to improve. I hope you can still hear me, Andy. Your video has dropped. Can you hear me? Okay, I will assume everybody else can hear me. And in terms of no, you're back. Did you hear me during that time, Andy?
I stepped away for a very scary 10 seconds, hoping I could come back. So I missed the last bit.
Okay, all right. So I was trying to answer the accountability question.
Right.
In terms of the lived experience, it's a very tricky one to get your arms around. The analogy I'd use is kind of investing, right? Let's say you give money to a firm to invest for you in something. That I'd say that firm is equivalent to a grantee in my example. You don't want to tell them what to do. The reason you're going to them is they have something that they're bringing to this. They have expertise, and they have trust, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think the way you bring this lived experience in is as a board, you start to ask for that type of information and see how that changes or doesn't change over time, right? You don't want to be telling a staff, oh, give money to this organization versus that organization because this one looks more diverse than this one. Because in this very specific situation, that might be a bad call. There might be all sorts of issues with the one that looks more diverse than with the one that maybe looks less, right? But if you say that, but if you're really looking at how these things trend over time, I think you will have a lot of incentives built in for the staff to work towards making that change, right? If it's something they have to report on quarterly and annually, my experience is that tends to focus the mind to do that. So I hope that's answering that question the way I understood it. But I can only really talk about it from kind of a board perspective. And to me, that's the way a board would go about it, is to look to get information and keep on asking about it. And if those numbers don't change, then there should be consequences.
No, I really appreciate that. I think actually, I appreciate you again referencing sort of the need for boards to drive change. Obviously, functionally, for the most part, grant seekers are interacting with funder staffs. That said, I've had a great revelation on our board recently, where our board has been tasking us with talking to end users, not only our NGO partners, but figuring out constructive ways to develop feedback mechanisms with beneficiary populations and communities. So we've seen it in action in the last year or two with Siegel Family, where our board is driving change, and we are saying how high, and it's actually been tremendous in this regard. Mm-hmm. I have another great question. This one from my friend Madeline Ballard, formerly of Last Mile Health, and I want to read it straight to you because so you get the gist. Are you able to speak to the Luddite trap? The need to be learning and solving structural problems, not at the expense of meeting people where they're at in a solidarity-based way with evidence-based support that works now. So for example, we're in a global pandemic and we're hearing a lot of, we don't want to fund masks, we want to build systems. We're building systems, but in this moment, people just need help with masks. So how do you balance that sort of immediate need and desire to build systems?
Okay. I mean, one approach I think would be, this is where collaboration comes in, okay? So there are organizations that are set up well to get masks to people, right? And they need to be supported, right? So if you have a diverse ecosystem of funders that sit down and talk to each other, they can say, well, we're pretty well equipped to do this, the masks, right? Someone else is pretty well equipped to support other things that we need to make sure continue to happen. And then you have a chance, I think, to collectively maybe get to a better place than if each each funder sat there by itself and tried to figure out how to balance that without knowing what everyone else is doing. Then I think you could end up with some unfortunate outcomes. And that is true of funders, and it's true of grantees. Like, grantees shouldn't just, okay, well, we got money from, just have their heads down, focused on their thing. They need to be able to sit down with others that are in different parts of this ecosystem to find out what they're doing, so that they can be better at informing the grant makers about what the real needs are. So I think you address these things through collaboration, and that way you have some information to kind of have a whole field of different actors act in a more productive way.
Yeah, well said. I want to end with the question I posed to you previous, which is, given your experiences at the foundations and your work in AAI, what would the Oppentang Foundation look like? What's the vision of your own? Where's your passion lie, and where's that process that meets that passion come from?
Okay, so the Oppentang Foundation. Okay, I guess we can play if I won the lottery game, right? Mm-hmm. For me, I think that things have to be engaged in and stuck to over the long term, and I would be focusing in education, and I'd be focusing on developing really terrific relationships with a number of institutions that would be partners for the long term, and really just focus on that. So every year, that a significant number of people are benefiting from that stability, and you have enduring institutions. So I'd be very focused on at that education at the institutional level, and just try to stick to that for a long time.
We hope you win the lottery. I think that's probably music to the ears of a lot of the folks who are listening in. Let me ask you one final ask of you. I'll let you ruminate while I offer some very brief concluding remarks from my side. Is just give us your typical listener today is folks that we would term African visionaries, right? So local actors who have an incredible idea, maybe the lack of an evidence base yet, but want to take it to scale, have an incredible ambition to serve vulnerable communities, probably are doing it on the fumes of some grant money, right? So we're talking about folks with annual budgets from $0 to a few $100,000 USD, perhaps. We're really struggling to build a bench, that evidence base, trying to mobilize interest and the resources, to take this good idea to scale. What's your words of inspiration for them? I'll give you a minute to consider. Mm-hmm. But on my side, I appreciate it. We have our team Slack channel, and it is full of fanboys and gals who are saying, Mr. Oppentang is the wise owl that we expected him to be. We're so glad we invited him. And I want to say on behalf of our listeners and our team, as well as our board of directors, who I think are quite forward-looking, we want to thank you for this. This has been a really useful conversation. It's good to move past generalizations, social media, 140 character critiques of philanthropy, to something more constructive and perhaps nuanced. Recognizing that there are appreciable, tangible ways to move from rhetoric to action, and there are appreciable and tangible examples we can learn from and lean on, whether it be Ford or Hilton, or I hope in some instances Siegel family. So thank you for your time, and give us your concluding words, please.
I think that a lot of social entrepreneurs, like many entrepreneurs, they put just too much stress and pressure on themselves. Those of us that are lucky get to live, a good number of years, and we don't have to do everything in the first 5 years that we get into something. So I think it's if you have an idea that you're really struggling to get support for, I would think about trying to collaborate with more people who might also have those ideas. I would also devote enough time to learning in your earlier years and working with people who maybe had a great idea in a generation before you, because a lot of the reason a lot of ideas that are really great ideas don't end up becoming something that gets sustained and that an organization gets built around, I think is that people haven't had the time to learn all of the things that aren't that attractive, right, to people. It's like, how does one build an organization? How does one work collaboratively with people? How does one listen better? How does one have the patience to stick with something for the long term? And it becomes a very lonely world, I think, if you just focus on your idea and keep on, you're kind of determined to scale no matter what. I think one of the things I think this crisis has taught me is that one needs to have kind of a longer frame, because there are always things that one doesn't anticipate that come along. Sometimes they help you, right? Sometimes you have a great idea that the market isn't receiving, and then events occur and all of a sudden it's the thing, right? So I would say, people who really want to make a difference in the world, stay hopeful and stay flexible, and be willing sometimes to put off your immediate idea to kind of work with other people on other things that you think also are very interesting. And I think all of us need to take ourselves less seriously, right? So I know a number of visionaries, and what's common among them all is they don't think of themselves that way, right? They really don't see what's so special, right? And we will look at them and we're like, wow. And so I think you keep that humility and keep that patience. I think a lot more things will happen.
Well said. Thank you for your time, sir. On behalf of everyone listening, we implore you to keep building bridges. We'll keep opening doors, and the future's bright. Very good. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.